Now that we know what cultural responsive orientation and mobility or teaching is, how do we actually step into that version of ourselves? Now that we already know what independence looks like for our learners, and they're all going to be different, what are some of the barriers? How do we actually achieve it? We're diving into all of that in this part 2 of our podcast and YouTube video. If you haven't already listened to part 1, definitely go ahead and hop on back over there. It aired last week. That'll give you a good foundation of what we're even doing in this video and podcast episode. But if you're ready to dive into part 2, come along because we're about to dive into some really great details. And I'm still curious, what happened with Uncle Steve? Welcome back to the podcast, my friend. This presentation has got to have been one of my favorite of all time because we got to see in real life what actually happens when you have people who are independent and they have visual impairments. You might have seen Oseas start from his work and then jump into a car, and then I wonder, where is this man going to end up? We're watching him travel in real time. And so if you're watching the YouTube video, definitely pay attention to that. It's one of my favorite aspects. And also, we can do as many run throughs as we want, but in the moment, technology is going to be technology. And it's really cool to see how Uncle Steve navigates technology. And not to be a spoiler, but he might make an appearance. In this episode, we get to dive into a little bit deeper of concepts. We want to know how our clients actually have their family or support network help them in their orientation and mobility training, or if they get to include them at all. We get to find out what barriers to accessing orientation and mobility are involved with that community, and the cultural modifications that the orientation and mobility specialists made to create successful learning environments for their clients. If you're not already watching the YouTube video, head on over to youtube.com and find us at Allied Independence so that way you can see exactly what we're talking about. There are some pictures shown on the screen that you'll probably want to see. There's a cane that's made that's really cool. All of these things are really foundational moments, and they will help make your experience better. If you are listening to this as a podcast episode, that is a-okay. Luckily, we audio describe everything for you. All right, let's get to the show.
Okay, so next we are going to look at, or we want to know, how do you include your family or support networks in your O&M training? Sayas, we're going to have you start.
Well, since my siblings grew up with me being blind, I think my mom played a major role. She learned from my instructors, O&M instructors, when I was a child, to let my siblings know how important it was for me to learn about my environment. So when we were younger, I used to ask them for a description of surroundings, as if we were playing soccer in the soccer field, or if I was riding the bike, and then later on crossing the street, they would tell me, okay, so we are in a corner of the street, or the school where you are, because some of them went to school with me, different grades. They would describe things. So it's been always an open communication with them about my orientation. And whenever I need something, I ask them for the description of my environment. So yeah, to answer your question in a few words, I having an open communication with them about orientation and mobility has helped me get involved in my mobility, my orientation.
Excellent. Okay, so Jeremy, how about you? How do you include family supports and networks in your O&M training or when you're working with your clients?
I think, as I say, it's so important because unlike when I'm working in the city in Brisbane, where I live, or where I've worked in the cities before, you can enjoy an opportunity to see people every fortnight or so. Or whereas in these communities, you need somebody who's consistently with that person to say, hey, can you come along with us on the lesson? And very often that person's the driver as well, or the carer, or the support worker, and they can come out. And the beautiful thing about that is they're learning about the skills as well. And if they're learning the skills, there's a little bit of poetic license where you might come back and they've picked up a few habits, but usually they've learned some pretty good cane skills and they've learned the terrain. And I'm usually working in places where I know very little about the actual area and they know everything. So I'm always on the back foot on that, which is great, but it's good. And I think a very important thing that when we get Steve on too is something I say to people is what would you like? And there was one of the first things Indigenous people says, we don't want a white cane. We want a cane with Indigenous colors on it. So it's glorious colors, the black, yellow, and the different colors up the length of the cane, and that gives them their pride. And so we've found an Australian company that's very happy to put those colors onto the long cane. And that's something now I carry in my kit bag to say, hey, what do you think about this? And that's great, yeah.
When they use those colors, do they use reflective tape for those colors? Or is it?
Yeah, still reflective. Probably an Australian thing. Some people put their football colors on them too. I think it's tricky if you put a very dark color on, like purple or black, because sighted people come out of shops and don't really see the cane and that sort of thing. But I think, and the same thing too with long canes is sometimes adapting the tips as well, because we walk in some pretty rough terrain. So things like the Dakota tip's been quite good. Bundu Bash has been a very popular tip. Very good for winding your way through the goat tracks or the dirt tracks and that sort of thing. And yeah, I was teaching a guy not long ago in Darwin who had a habit of pointing at things and pointing to people. So he'd have to sort of step back when he was pointing with his cane. But yeah, it's a fascinating world, but I've learned a lot since I've just learned to listen and ask them actually what they want. And that's very different. I think Cassie's got a couple of pictures there of a light plane coming into one of the islands that I go to sometimes too. But
Great. Do you mind sharing that, Cassie?
Here you go.
Perfect. Can you describe that?
We're flying into Palm Island. For those of you who've been to Australia, it's off the coast from Townsville. Townsville at present is actually having a direct connection with a cyclone as we speak. So everybody's battling down in Townsville. Palm Island is about 20 minutes flight. You can't carry a lot of equipment. You can probably get away with one cane or a couple of canes and things like that, because you can't carry much on these little planes. And the reason I even go to Palm Island was I made a connection with the local optometrist who also flies out to that particular island. And he works with the Indigenous Health. There's an Indigenous Health clinic there, which have a really supportive, they have a group of GPs, they have a optometrist, so to say, they have nursing staff, they have people midwives and that sort of thing. And they come in from this clinic. The clinic is all decked out as an Indigenous clinic. It's got all the colors, people on the front desk who are Indigenous. So you feel like you're a guest when you arrive there. And it's so nice to have that set up, because it's a nice connection with the local people, and you're coming into their island, and they know, only they know the way around the island. And so yeah, it's very special. And I think with these projects, you start off little, you find one person you can train, and then you say to them, if they're impressed with the service, they will make sure they tell others about it. So if the word doesn't get around, you know you've not done a very good job.
Yeah, a lot of times we're our biggest PR people.
Yes, yeah. And they use language like, talk to this guy, he'll give you a stick, and go, that's great, thanks very much. Thanks very much.
Okay, so this is a two-pronged question. What were the barriers to accessing O&M services in your community, and how would you improve O&M services to people within your culture? So Oseas, I'd like to start with you. I'll read that again. What were the barriers to accessing O&M services in your community? We can start with that.
Well, in Guatemala, there's not too many certified O&M instructors. Very few. I will be embarrassed, but I believe when I was a child, maybe there were 3 or 4 for the entire country. We're talking back then 11 million people, so now it's 18 million people. It's a lot of people. There's definitely a lot of people who are visually impaired that do not receive the the services. Yes, I think that's the biggest barrier.
And then the second part of that question is, how would you improve O&M services to people within your culture?
Well, starting more, certifying more instructors, making workshops like this one to raise awareness of the need of this orientation mobility, how important it is for people who are blind and visually impaired.
Thank you so much for sharing. Jeremy, would you like to share about some of the barriers that were to accessing O&M services in maybe some of the indigenous communities in which you work?
Yeah, I think one of the barriers we have is because we are called guide dogs, and as an organization, it's called guide dogs. A lot of people in those communities think, well, we don't need a dog. We need particular training. So I think the thing is not to go into the community on a cold sell, if you know what I mean. It's important to work with people who have already made inroads through health and support and are there on a more regular basis. They're very used to organizations coming into and providing a service, and then due to funding or lack of access and that sort of thing, they may not see those organizations again. And so they have a bit of a recall of a history of not having a consistent service. And so you've really got to be providing a service and coming back again. And I think one of the ladies said on your video that it's a very slow process because they're used to a lot of organizations letting them down and not providing consistent services. Because that's just the nature of rural services, unfortunately. But I feel we're getting there slowly. There's an awful lot of people we don't see, and the only people we do get to see are the ones who put their hands up and say, "Yeah, I'll give this a go." And I think once we get to see a few people in these smaller areas, word gets around pretty quick. And it's not one of those things you do with white Australians where you put an advert on the radio, hey, say, have you got a low vision? We'll come and see you. Come to our local clinic. And it doesn't. You've got to really do the yard. You've got to go in there as someone who's listening to what they ask for, be very supportive, come back again, work with their local people, because if you just come in and work with them on their own and the local people don't know about you, then they won't have that understanding of the services you provide. And it's being flexible as well. And it's so rewarding when you do finally get someone who actually picks up on the skills and goes, yeah, I can use this. So there are barriers, but most of the barriers we have are probably ones we provide ourselves because we're working with that organizational constraints of how we do things. Yeah.
Sure. So one of the things I did hear you say is listening and learning first before we start to kind of go in there. What are some ways that you have listened and learned in order to make some inroads in some of those communities or to kind of break down some of those barriers?
I think a big thing is being able to hand over your skills, not own the skills of being an O&M, saying I will teach you one-to-one. If anything is better than not providing any services at all. So if an uncle or an auntie wants to teach somebody in their community how Jeremy taught somebody else, that's a really good start because they've started to understand the fact that that's how training can really help. And so I think it's a case of not owning and not being too protective about how precise things are doing, because a lot of these people are not crossing busy roads. They're not doing the Donna Salberger crossing 5 lanes, and they're on a island where they're trying to get around safely. There's a lot of trip hazards, and so we have to really modify the techniques. And the look they get when they walk through a community and people go, hey, what's he doing over there? And then you've got to stop and explain. And then if they're impressed enough, they'll then pass it on too. So yeah, I think the modifying your techniques, not being too clinical on your approach, and working with the local medical people and clinics to find out where they've tripped up in the past, where they've made mistakes. So yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Cassie, Can you please play A1 starting at, before you do, this is Autumn Booths. She lives in Juneau, Alaska, and she's an orientation and mobility specialist up in Juneau.
Were there any barriers to accessing O&M services in your community? If so, can you please share some examples? How would you improve O&M services to people within your culture? Here in southeastern Alaska, we have both the Tlingit and Haida cultures, and being a remote area, we have not had an O&M specialist for the students in person and full time in well over a decade. And with me coming in now, the students and the families have said to me they feel supported and they feel as though they can always ask questions because I am here all the time. And to help improve O&M services to people within the Tlingit and Haida cultures, I would like to continue learning how I can offer my services to adults who are older, who may be in need of O&M services now that I am in person full-time here in Juneau.
So I'm hearing a running theme through all of these folks, and I'm guessing you're all hearing it too, is that access is is a really big barrier. And if it's, especially in some of these more remote locations, I mean, we all, at least in the US, I know we're always talking about the O&M shortage. I imagine that's going to be in all countries, that we just don't have the number of professionals to meet the needs of all of the people. And especially as, you know, we've got baby boomers and our age-related vision loss, that population is going to continue to grow. And so depending on what your state or your province or your area looks like in terms of adult services, I mean, having a shortage and the supply is low, the demand is growing, you know, access just becomes a real issue. And I'm not here to say that, but I guess that's the tie that binds, right? Is that all of us, all of the clients, the comms are having issues with access. Just to add on to what Autumn said about, it's not just access, it's also consistency. So for her to be there and be there full time, that consistency and that relationship building and that trust building, as many of you said, which is a really big part of that culturally responsive teaching, those are things that she's been able to foster by working with that community for a consistent length of time. And I'm going to try to paraphrase or take out the key highlights from what Angel says. So try to listen as carefully as you can, but I'll also try to capture or restate some of the things that she says.
The first barrier is the environment. It's a very harsh environment in the winter, which is primarily when I work with my students. It's difficult at best. Like I said, many villages don't have roads. They have boardwalks. In the winter, when they're covered with snow, the snow is usually higher than the boardwalk and higher than the area, of course, that's under the boardwalk. And so it's very difficult to, you know, figure out where the edge is and safely move and navigate through feet of snow, sometimes 3, 4, 5 feet of snow, in negative degree temperatures. So the environment, it can be very harsh and very difficult, a huge barrier to accessing O&M services.
Okay, so one of the first barriers that Angel talks about here is the environment. Living in Alaska, and especially because Angel she's based in Anchorage, Alaska, but they focus on working with, and she'll describe this in her video when we talk about the next question, but she works out in the bush, in the remote areas, the rural areas of Alaska, which, I mean, Alaska is bigger than Texas. So if that gives you any idea of just the sheer size of Alaska. And so they only have a handful or they'll have few O&M specialists. So they have very harsh winters. Where they get a ton of snow. A lot of where she works is in villages that have boardwalks, but they don't have paved roads, and that's covered with snow. And sometimes the snow is so high that it's actually very difficult to feel where the edges of those boardwalks are. Also, with negative temperatures, I mean, if it's really cold here in Illinois, I'm not taking learners out, but sometimes you just have to figure out how to adapt with that. And so communicating with the learner and with the family and community, could be a solution for that, but just knowing that the environment as being a major barrier for instruction in Angel's specific context.
And the second barrier that I find are the belief systems of Native Alaskans. A lot of villages and the people there believe that if a student has no vision, that they will be taken care of their entire lives. It's never thought that that student should live independently or be able to navigate his environment independently. They just always know that they're going to be there. And so the belief system can be a huge barrier. Belief systems against canes. So those two things are probably the largest barriers that I face here in Alaska, working with students that have low vision or blindness and have O&M needs.
So one of the first questions we asked the panel was, what does independence mean to you? And we asked that question because, as we know, as I noted earlier, independence means something very different to each person. And I know that Angel mentioned it as one of the barriers. That's not necessarily wrong or incorrect. When we're talking about culturally responsive teaching practices, we want to meet people where they are. And so we're taught in our O&M programs a lot of the time that we're trying to do independent travel. We're trying to, push for independent travel and independence. And that's the ultimate goal. And what we're learning through this presentation and through hearing these different perspectives is that what we're learning how to do is be responsive to the cultures, not just our own. And so, like I said, what Angel said about it being a barrier, that it's that independent, or perspectives or belief systems about independence and about cane use can be perceived as a barrier. They're also a learning opportunity for us as orientation and mobility specialists to listen and learn and dive deeper into that. Okay, so our next question that we had for the panel is, what cultural modifications have you made to create more successful learning environment for your clients? So this is going to focus in a bit more on our O&M specialists. So Jeremy, if you'd like to start.
So I think first of all, fitting in with the community. The particular island I go to, Palm Island and places, there are the local community centres which have their own uniforms or polo shirts which have indigenous colours on them and things like that. So you're not walking in with big clinical looking shirts. I think that's important. As I mentioned before, the indigenous coloured canes, and I saw a couple of people say, is that against the law? No, you can actually have canes which are not white. As I'd say, it suits these particular cultures better to have their own colours. Gives people a conversation piece. I think you've got to be very careful not to have too many colours that are too dark because other people won't see them, especially if you're crossing roads and that sort of thing. It's also not just going in as the front person, but going in with somebody they know. I think that's what I've learned. There might be someone they know who does something completely different. It might be somebody who works in optometry or something, and he'll come along and he'll say, I brought Jeremy along today and he'd like to say hello to you. So not going in there and just trying to do it all on your own, fitting in with the community, sitting down under a tree, talking to people. Don't bring them into an office to do the assessment. So you bring a clipboard and hope paper doesn't blow all over the place, and sit on the edge of a fence and chat to people. And just remembering you're a guest in their particular community. I'm no expert, but if we have the same discussion, hopefully in 10 years' time, there'll be more progress.
Someone also mentioned being careful about what specific words they use or how they phrase things, and just, being aware of the language that you're using. Cassie, can you please play A2 starting at, play A2.
My client is a 9-year-old in our TCLL program here in Juneau, Alaska. TCLL stands for Tlingit Culture, Language, and Literacy. And this program is part of our district, but it is separate. And being the orientation and mobility specialist who comes into that program, although it is housed in a district building, I do recognize that it is a separate program. And keeping that in mind, I got to know my students and their my student and their classmates and the teacher and the other teachers in that program before really stepping in and trying to help those teachers implement O&M skills even more in detail. And I have tried my best to learn a little bit more about their culture and about how they view persons with disabilities. And when I asked someone that question, one of the teachers, they said, we just view it as someone who needs a little bit more help. So we will step in and we help them, or we ask them if they need help and then we help them. And so to better my knowledge of our Tlingit and Haida clans here in southeastern Alaska, I applied for the cultural orientation course that is being offered this year. This is a brand new course. And although it is not visual impairment specific, it is clan specific, so that I can better my knowledge base and continue to support my student both in the classroom as well as outside the classroom and in their community.
So hopefully all of you were able to hear what Autumn shared. In her community, they actually have a cultural orientation course that helps. It's brand new, and it's something that she has available to her. And I recognize that this isn't available to everybody, but it offers her the opportunity to learn in-depth knowledge about the Tlingit and the Haida communities with whom she works. And so that's kind of a I think at least a rare opportunity. Does anyone else have, Cassie, if you could play Angel's video from the start until 3:10?
Hi, my name is Angel Black, and I am the teacher for visually impaired and the orientation and mobility specialist at the Special Education Service Agency in Anchorage, Alaska. We serve students in rural Alaska. We go to all the places that are not on the road system in Alaska. So we get to go to Bush, Alaska, we get to go to the villages and serve all of the Native children in those areas. I'm going to answer just a few questions. The first question is, what cultural modifications have I made to create a successful learning environment for my students? Every time I go out, there are cultural modifications that need to be made. The Alaskan Native culture, economy, and traditional way of life are intimately tied to living off the land, gathering, hunting, and fishing for food. It's a subsistence lifestyle. So many of my students' families are worried that their children will not be able to help provide the food for families as they grow. So as an O&M specialist, one of the first things we do is figure out a way to make that happen for my students. One recent way was I had a student that was going on a muskox hunt. And so we had to figure out a way for him to go safely on this muskox hunt, to be able to find the muskox, and to be able to shoot the muskox with a bow and arrow. So we've worked a long time to make that happen, but ultimately he has had several successes, and he's thrilled with the results, as is his family. Another student I have, his parents did not want him to use a cane at all in the village. He was allowed to use it in school while he was walking around at school, but not in the village. This is a village that is built on a river, so the soil is very marshy. There are no roads at all in the village. There are only boardwalks. So it was very, very important that he learned to use a cane so he could safely navigate the village alone and independently. So at first we decorated his cane in using cultural artifacts that were important to him, and his parents still didn't like it. So eventually I had a cane made for him that has a seal skin cover. This is real seal skin. This was made and created by a Native woman in Northwest Alaska. We still have the red tip at the end, and it was made in such a way that the cane can still be taken apart and folded.
Okay, so just to kind of recap what Angel shared, So it's her CISA, it's Special Education Service Agencies. And she worked, like I mentioned before, she works in rural Alaska in the villages. And so one of the ways that one of the cultural modifications she did was that she worked with the community in order to figure out a way so that her learner could be a part of muskox hunting, because one of the concerns of the family was that this student would not be able to contribute with the hunting, the fishing, gathering, because they live off the land. That's what they do in that community. And so through communicating with them, she was able to work with the family and go out with them on a muskox hunt, and figured out and worked with him on how to find and shoot a bow and arrow. And then also, as you saw, the sealskin covered cane, which eventually became accepted by the family to be used in the community.
Hello?
Oh, there's Steve. There's Uncle Steve.
I've been here all the time.
Oh,
I've heard everything, but apparently I wasn't on screen.
can you do us a favor real quick and introduce yourself?
Yeah, Steve Witters. I'm from Armidale, New South Wales, in Australia. I'm an Indigenous Australian. I've been a user of guide dogs, canes, for 30 years. And Jeremy was talking about the red, black, and yellow cane.
Yay!
This is my one here. I was showing it, but I didn't realise wasn't on the screen. And I've been applied for 30 years, and I do have some issues about support, because and I can relate to the people in Alaska as well. We're very isolated, we're very big, and we don't have a lot of people around. I live in a large provincial city in New South Wales, and we don't have any base for guide dogs there, or Vision Australia, and we have to have irregular visits from people. I haven't had a occupation of, I haven't had a mobility and orientation lesson for over 12 months, probably because we haven't got the staff to do it. And I've been using it for over 30 years now, so I'm pretty used to it anyway. But if I require it, I'd probably have to wait for a while for them to come. I certainly don't have the issues that some people in Alaska have, about the boardwalks and or the boardwalks and all that sort of stuff with the snow up high. Very fortunate I am, and I really appreciate the services that guide dogs do offer and can offer. It has allowed me to have that independence and mobility, and it allows me to have a good quality of life, and to be able to participate in the workforce, and to have a social life as well. I've got a lot of support within family and within the community. I've always been grateful for the work with guide dogs, both guide dogs and Vision Australia, in Australia. And it's good to learn what's going on in other countries as well, particularly up in Alaska. Good day to Steve Bailey up there in Fairbanks. I'm alumni from UAF up in Fairbanks. I used to go there, and I had my white cane when I first started using it. Many times I lost it in the snow in the middle of winter, so I can relate to that. That's all I've got to say. And I did listen to everything that was said, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I don't know what's happened there about screen wasn't on or anything.
We'll have to have you back another day, Steve, but hopefully you agreed with things. I was trying to wing it there for you for a while.
Now, listen, Jeremy, I heard everything you said, and I agree. I agree with all the stuff that was said.
Thank you.
I just don't know why I wasn't on screen or why I couldn't unmute.
Hey,
Steve, I've got a support worker who just come in who did it for me. Who did it for me just towards the end. So.
Well, we got you in the end, and you made a grand entrance, so that's fantastic. And I suppose one more quick question is how do we promote the services better? Sometimes people are a bit reluctant to take up the services. Is it something where someone like you who's got a support?
I think Indigenous organisations are pretty good to do that. Yep. There are statewide organisations, there are national ones in Australia, like in Alaska. You have Aboriginal health services, Aboriginal medical services, Aboriginal community groups. I think we should get them to do it in our communities. You've got people there where people live. For example, there's half a dozen good organisations here in my town, which is a small town of about 30,000 people, about the same as Fairbanks. Steve,
Yeah.
Our town, Steve Varley up in Fairbanks. Use the organisations, use the existing organisations that are there, and some of the community active community people that are here as well, and promote it through, the land councils that are statewide. Promote your services through our services through there.
That's definitely the way to do it, rather than going in there on your own and wondering why people aren't coming to you. So thank you very much.
You've got people that are there. And as you said in the start there, Jeremy, guide dogs, the name guide dogs puts people off. A lot of people don't want a dog. They don't want a dog, but if they know that they can offer cane and mobility training and orientation, they might be more acceptable to it. And I in my own community, I speak to people with vision impairments, and I show them the use of a cane and how to use it and what to do. Encourage them to take up the service from both Vision Australia and Guide Dogs. And another way of doing this is go through the local disability networks as well, and NDIS providers.
Just a quick closure. What year did you do the Dakota Trail as a fundraiser, and how long did that take
you? I did that with another blind person, both cane users, in 2012. The Dakota Trail's in New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, which is north of Australia.
Oh.
And me and another blind person traversed 96 kilometres. We wanted to do it as blind people. We were the first two blind men to cover it, to honour soldiers that supported Australia in the Second World War. But our project that we had was called Blind Courage.
Okay, so we learned that Oseas got home to where he was going, and Uncle Steve was able to log in and get his mic and video working with the help of an assistant. Living with a visual impairment has its challenges. We know that. Living in a culture that is different from your teachers also has its barriers and its challenges, but that doesn't mean that they can't be overcome. Steve overcame the challenge of having to get his mic unmuted and get his video on. The young learner from Alaska, she overcame her own challenges. Angel Black, our comms in Alaska, she talked about the challenges that her learners have had to overcome. Autumn Booths, also a teacher in Alaska, has had to overcome her own challenges moving from the lower 48 up to the Alaskan Territory just recently. Jeremy, although native to Australia, has had to overcome his own challenges reaching Indigenous people. Maybe we all have challenges. Maybe if we take a step outside of our cultural norms and really work to see what could be more beneficial for our learners, despite what color cane they're using, maybe we'll all be better teachers. Some of the ways that I look at cultural responsiveness here in Texas are simple things. I've heard of teachers, actually Dr. Conchita Hernandez was saying that what she does is, instead of using a phone to get in touch with the parents of the students that she works with, that she uses WhatsApp because they're more likely to be on WhatsApp. Or maybe you tell parents to show up 45 minutes earlier to a meeting, knowing that they're going to be about an hour late anyway. Or maybe it's that you teach your learners how to make a quesadilla and not a casserole. Little things like that that really impact the learner's life, that really bring their culture into the spotlight and allow them to shine. That's what's going to make the difference. During the presentation, we did somehow get on the topic of like a color of cane. And sometimes in the chat at the O&M Symposium, the chat can go one way and the presentation's going another. And we circled it back. I don't think the color of the cane matters. I think what matters is your intention and your impact. As an orientation and mobility specialist and as a VI specialist, we are consistently concerned about not just our intention, but our impact. And if we can make a way to have the impact of our lessons be even greater because we are intentionally creating a culturally responsive environment. It's going to be even more rich for our learners. So I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a comment, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, even on the blog. Let me know how you're stepping into being a more culturally responsive VI specialist. Are there any specific strategies that you use? What have your experiences been? I'd love to hear it all. Until next week, I hope that you can take this information and help you take a step forward.